When you think of vampires, you might imagine the classic Dracula, a sophisticated, immortal figure, or perhaps a more savage type, like cold-blooded killing machines driven by a never-ending thirst for blood. These creatures are said to fear silver and sunlight. Surprisingly, there are tales of their existence dating back to the early 18th century. During this time, after the Austrian Empire took control of Belgrade and parts of Serbia, strange deaths were reported in Serbian villages. These villages, now under Austrian rule, claimed to be under attack by inhuman enemies. Austrian officials initially dismissed these reports as superstition, but when they sent medical officers and soldiers to investigate, they discovered something unsettling. This is the story of the Austrian army encountering vampires. As you journey through this tale, you'll face a fog of war, where reality blurs with superstition. In the early 18th century, the Austrian Habsburg monarchy was at war with the Ottoman Empire. After a brutal conflict, Austria expanded its empire into the Balkans, including territories like Serbia. Explorers and administrators were sent to map these new lands. In 1725, one such explorer, Provar Fald, arrived in the fishing village of Kilo, located along the Danube River in northeastern Serbia. In his journey through Serbia, Provar Fald was assigned to document many villages, including the humble town of Kalo. While observing the village and its people, Fald witnessed a strange and unsettling ritual. One day, Fald noticed an angry crowd gathered at the town cemetery. Curious, he made his way through the crowd and saw that they were digging up a recently buried man, around 60 years old. Despite being buried only a short time ago, the corpse looked surprisingly fresh, with no signs of decay. Fald watched as some villagers hurled insults at the corpse while others prayed silently. The priest read scripture passionately, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Then, things took a darker turn when one man retrieved a sharpened stake and a mallet from a crate. He drove the stake into the corpse's chest, causing fresh blood to flow from the body. Fald was shocked by the scene. He wondered if the man was truly dead, considering the amount of blood pouring from his wounds. How could a corpse without a beating heart produce so much blood? Provar Fald, the administrator, could have sworn he heard the man groan in pain when they impaled him. Fald was increasingly puzzled by what he saw next. The men, seemingly well-rehearsed, lowered the bloody corpse back into the open grave and set it on fire. The smell of burning flesh filled the air as flames consumed the body. The crowd watched in eerie silence as the fire grew higher into the darkening sky. Fald asked his guide about what he had witnessed. The guide, hesitant and frightened, explained that they had just executed a vampire. Fald was confused, so the guide clarified that a vampire was a foul and predatory spirit that craved human blood. Later that evening, Fald wrote a detailed report of the day's events. This report, published in the summer of 1725, was the first documented use of the word vampire in history. According to the document, the dead man Fald witnessed being impaled was named Petar Bovic. 10 weeks before Fald's arrival in the town of Kisu, Petar, a man of about 60, had passed away after a brief illness. However, shortly after his burial, mysterious deaths began to occur in the village. The victims claimed to have been attacked by Petar in their dreams, strangling them before they woke up. Within 8 days, 9 more villagers died under similar circumstances. The villagers, familiar with dealing with vampires, exhumed Petar's body and found signs of vampirism. His flesh still looked lifelike. His hair and nails had grown, and there was fresh blood around his mouth. Despite laws against such practices, the villagers believed they had to kill the vampire to protect themselves. In a solemn and somber ceremony, prayers were said before a sharpened stake made of hawthorn wood was driven into the vampire's heart. The hawthorn tree was believed to have special spiritual powers. After this final effort to rid the body of the vampire, the remains were burned, and thus the vampire of Kelo was vanquished. Provar Fald's account of the Kisu vampire, submitted to the Imperial Austrian court in 1725, gave the Western world its first real glimpse of these terrifying creatures. The story spread through Europe's most famous journals and newspapers, fueling fears and imaginations across the continent. Despite religious laws condemning belief in vampires and killing them, even the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI showed keen interest in these creatures. He sent copies of Fald's findings to European leaders and ordered all reports of vampire activity to be sent directly to the imperial court. 6 years later, in 1731, when reports of mysterious deaths reached Austrian officials, they swiftly responded. This time, the reports came from a remote Serbian village called Media. Initially, authorities suspected a viral outbreak, but the deaths were mysterious, with victims dying within days of falling ill, showing no previous signs of disease. Under the orders of Lieutenant Colonel Schnetzer, a team of medical officers and infectious disease experts led by a man named Glosser was dispatched to investigate. Glosser, determined to uncover the truth, exhumed several bodies with the help of reluctant villagers. Glosser found that despite the recent deaths, there was little decomposition, even in bodies buried weeks earlier. There were no signs of known diseases or infections like sores, rashes, or boils on their skin, adding to the mystery. As Glosser investigated further, he found no bodily secretions around the mouths or noses of the deceased, which was unusual. Despite his efforts to find logical explanations in medical books, the villagers' persistent claims became harder to dismiss. Though the imperial specialists seemed skeptical, the villagers were convinced they were facing one or more vampires. While we may not face hordes of vampires, we all have our own personal battles to contend with. When Glosser's report reached the Austrian headquarters at the K.H. Magden Fortress in Belgrade, it described a serious situation. Despite efforts, the infectious disease experts couldn't find evidence of a viral outbreak. Strangely, they started to consider the villagers' belief in vampires. Tensions rose as Serbian villagers clashed with imperial authorities, enforcing laws against staking and burning suspected vampires. In January 1732, troops were sent to the village, including Baron Felin Buscher's Foot Regiment, the Maruli Regiment, and the Alexandrian Regiment. Among them was regimental field surgeon Johann Flukinger. Flukinger, like many in science and medicine, was skeptical of superstitions but found the reports intriguing. The Austrians reluctantly listened to the villagers, who seemed sincere and distressed. Surprisingly, their stories were consistent. The trouble began 5 years earlier with the death of a local man named Arnaud Piol. Before his death, Arnaud claimed he tried to protect himself from a vampire by eating dirt from its grave and smearing himself with its blood. However, he later died tragically, and 4 villagers reported terrifying dreams of him tormenting them. These villagers died under similar circumstances, suggesting vampirism was at play. The local elders came up with a plan to stop Arnaud Piol from harming anyone else. When they dug up his body, buried 40 days earlier, they found it remarkably preserved, with fresh blood smeared all over him, even inside the coffin. As they drove a stake into his heart, Arnaud seemed to groan, and more blood flowed from his mouth, nose, eyes, and ears. Despite burning his body, the villagers were dismayed to find that their vampire troubles were not over. Flukinger and his men listened as the villagers explained the recent deaths. Arnaud, during his time of terror, had fed on the blood of several young calves. The villagers believed that eating the meat of these calves had passed the vampire's curse onto those who consumed it. Before the Austrian military arrived, the villagers had already staked and burned one suspected vampire. Flukinger, an expert in contagious diseases, ordered examinations and autopsies on all suspected vampires to prevent further panic. They found that 10 of the deceased, ranging from 60-year-old men to 8-day-old infants, showed signs of vampirism. Flukinger and his colleagues worked tirelessly, conducting thorough autopsies on each supposed vampire. The surgeons, like the disease specialists before them, were puzzled by their findings. They found no evidence of a new viral strain causing the deaths. Despite being dormant, the bodies looked fresh and healthy, as if they were in suspended animation. Warm blood flowed from their bodies with each cut, and in one case, a woman who had been thin in life appeared to gain weight after death. Reluctantly, the imperial troops agreed to destroy the bodies as requested by the terrified locals. The people of Media efficiently disposed of the bodies, staking, burning, and returning them to their graves. Strangely, this seemed to stop the deaths. The Austrian troops couldn't deny that these rituals performed by the Serbs were effective. Returning to Belgrade, Flukinger's report ignited further debate. Scholars, religious leaders, and court officials discussed whether vampires were real and if people needed to fear them. Eventually, in 1746, Vatican scholar D. Austin K. concluded that vampires were creatures of imagination, not a real threat. Over the last 3 centuries, fears of vampires have largely faded, thanks to rational explanations and scientific understanding. Humanity's understanding of the natural world has greatly improved over time. Historical cases of vampirism can be explained by a lack of scientific knowledge and strong religious beliefs. Back then, it didn't take much to convince a whole village that evil spirits were causing trouble. Even today, many people believe in unseen spiritual forces that affect humanity through illness, nightmares, and strange visions. While the truth behind vampire attacks is uncertain, the belief in vampires is almost universal. Different cultures have their own stories of malevolent beings that prey on the living, with various abilities and characteristics. In the 20th century, vampires became more romanticized in popular culture, but in 18th century Serbia, they were seen as unholy creatures. Today, vampires are mostly seen as fictional creatures, relics of ancient folklore. However, in rural Serbia, belief in vampires still persists. In 2012, the collapse of a 300-year-old water mill in the village of Zosia, western Serbia, caused alarm. The residents believed the mill was home to a dangerous vampire named Sava Savanovic. Tour guides refused to go near the mill after sunset, and the owners refused to perform maintenance, fearing they might disturb Savanovic. The fear and neglect led to the mill's collapse, supposedly freeing the angry vampire into the hills. Terrified, the people of Zosia relied on ancestral knowledge, stocking up on garlic, hanging crucifixes, and arming themselves with stakes. For 7 months, they remained vigilant, but nothing more happened. Eventually, the mill was rebuilt and life returned to normal. Outsiders might find this amusing, but to the rural Serbians, it's a reminder of the mysterious forces that exist beyond scientific understanding. Just like the Austrian soldiers and disease experts who faced strange deaths and phenomena long ago, there are things in this world that defy explanation.